Welcome everyone again to today's webinar focused on meaningful measurements in GLP-1 research and development supported by digital health technologies. We all know about GLP-1s, how much a lot has been already researched and shared about them, but it is also important to think about how we generate relevant evidence about their safety, efficacy, long-term use, and well-being of the patients, most importantly. Digital health tools has been can be a great addition to these efforts, and today we are going to explore what benefits they can bring to the relevant populations of interest. First, a few housekeeping items. We are recording our session today. Slides and recording are going to be available on DIME's webinar website, also in your inboxes, and the participants are not permitted to transcribe this webinar. To ask a question for discussion, you can either raise your hand or post your question in the chat, and we will have time at the end of the hour to go to those questions and pick a few that we can answer. So now, before we begin, let's find out from you, our audience, what your views are about digital measurements. Whether you think they can add value. Do you think, let us know in a short poll that you should be seeing in your screens right now, and we'll share the results. Curious what you think. I'll give you a few seconds. We have some responses coming in. Amazing. Okay, so we see that 3/4 of you think that, both in research and development and commercial use can benefit from digital health technologies. So let's unpack that in our conversation today. So let us bring in our speakers, our panelists, and introduce them one by one, starting with Melissa Cerullo.
Thanks, Lucy. And I am really excited to be here on this fantastic panel today. My name is Melissa Cerullo, and I oversee engineering and biomarker analytics at Medidata. My background is in medical devices. I've been design and developing devices that are either worn or very closely used by patients and been analyzing data generated from patients for over 20 years. And we've seen a lot of different types of emerging technologies. This particular topic today is a really emerging topic, exciting topic, and really looking forward to the discussion. Allison?
I'm Allison Goldfein. It is an honor to have been invited by Digital Medicine Society to be on this panel. I am an executive director of translational medicine for cardiovascular diseases at Novartis. I am also a practicing clinician at the Brigham and Women's Hospital. Any views I give are my own and do not reflect either Novartis or the Brigham and Women's Hospital. And next, I think it's Dr. Rothberg.
Hi, everyone. Thanks very much for inviting me. Just like Dr. Goldfein, I'm grateful that Digital Medicine Society invited me to be part of this discussion. I'm a professor of medicine in the division of metabolism, endocrinology, and diabetes, and also professor of nutritional sciences in our School of Public Health, all at the University of Michigan. And I take care of patients living with overweight and obesity and cardiometabolic risk factors or diseases. And I spend my research life studying interventions to reduce obesity and cardiometabolic risk and disease. And I'll turn it over to Bob Sala.
Mute, that would work. My name is Bob Sala, and I am the director of data and hardware integration for use in clinical research at Dexcom. Predominantly, Dexcom is a commercial company, commercial use, but I work with those third parties and partners that need to integrate it for Part 11 compliance. My background is literally out of Hopkins, I started doing some research and got involved with insulin pumps in the mid 80s with a famous physician years ago who unfortunately has left us, Chris Sodick. And I've been involved in insulin pumps and CGM ever since. So I don't even want to count the years at this point, but it's been a long time. Thank you. And I'm going to hand it over to Paul Strange.
Thank you, Bob, and thank you for the organizers for inviting me. I have spent my life in medical product development with a heavy slant in diabetes, pumps, insulins, CGM devices, infusion sets, and a lot of other things. The last 20 years, I left pharma, and the last 20 years I've run a CRO. And one of the things we do there is analyze CGM data and use that in medical product development. And we are, full disclosure, one of Dexcom partners that helps collect data.
Thank you very much, everyone. And my name is Lucy Sosnakova, and I will be your moderator today. I belong to the Digital Medicine Society and excited to welcome all of our panelists, speakers here, and all of you in the audience. So let's dive right into it, right? Let's set the stage. So as I said, a lot has been shared and researched about GLP-1s, what their mechanism of action is, how they work. But let's unpack what their benefits are for different populations, how their mechanism of action translates to, for example, people with diabetes, people with obesity or overweight, or even the non-diabetic people, populations who are increasingly taking this medication. This is maybe a good question for some of our clinician colleagues on the call.
Well, I'll start. I mean, it's been an ever-evolving, rapidly changing landscape with these options. I mean, 20 years ago, we were studying them for their impact on glycemia, and now we have indications looking at heart failure, both preserved and reduced ejection fraction. They're now being studied for atrial fibrillation, obviously diabetes and pre-diabetes, earlier studies with even one of the older GLP-1s, liraglutide. They've been studied for in populations with sleep apnea, both those who use CPAP and non-users of CPAP. So the list is expanding every day. Indications are expanding every day. There is research now looking at neurodegenerative diseases. We have outcomes on MASLD, even in addiction medicine, such as those who are substance users. So it's a very exciting time for these, what we used to call novel therapeutics. They're no longer that new.
Amazing. Thank you very much. So we know for GLP-1 agonists, right, the weight and BMI, and especially their use in obesity and diabetes, the weight and BMI have been the dominant endpoints in the research and clinical development. But we know there is much more than that, much more to unpack. If you had to define what a high quality weight loss is, what are some of the additional important signals that we should be capturing to assess efficacy, safety, and long-term outcomes? I know that there has been a lot of discussion about losing fat versus muscle, about metabolic stability, even functional outcomes. What would be some additional things for us to look at in the research and development for these new therapies?
So maybe I'll take this one since Dr. Rothberg started, and I think that really does depend upon the patient. If you have a patient with no diabetes but with sleep apnea, the most important endpoint to that individual is going to be their sleep apnea. Whereas if you have a patient with diabetes and no sleep apnea, the most pressing problem would be different. So I think what's really remarkable about these compounds is that we finally have a class of drugs that are able to achieve a magnitude of weight loss that is equivalent to many of the metabolic surgeries and can lead to improvements in other weight-related comorbidities. Some of the improvements are likely directly related to the weight loss. Some may actually be independent of the weight loss and direct mechanisms of the drugs, but those are currently under investigation. I think that overall, what's striking is that in the populations in who they've been studied, that the major adverse outcomes are actually positively affected that include cardiovascular death, which is a leading cause of morbidity and mortality in our patients, and many other forms of metabolic disorders. But then you get down to the fine tuning as to whether or not there are patients for whom these are less appropriate, such as those who already have very substantial muscle loss, and what is the impact of this, if any, clinically on these patients, because we see very few patients coming in the near term of having used them, and now we have some really emerging long-term use for fatigue or for weakness complaints. So it's a very important topic to understand, but clinically has been less prominent for creating clinical problems than, say, some of the complications or adverse effects like the GI complications of taking these drugs.
Wonderful, thank you. And please, anyone else, feel free to speak up too. This is a really interesting topic to unpack. So you just named a range of things that can be also interesting to evaluate in the research. And let's stay with this research case a little bit longer, right? So following what we have just heard, and also a question for everyone else, how do you think the sensor-based digital health technologies can help capture these additional signals in a maybe more continuous, objective, and clinically meaningful way? And if you have had any, and I'm sure you have, experience with their implementation, what, if any, that has been? I'm curious.
So I think I can say one thing. We had a small paper many years ago where we had concurrent quality of life data, traditional quality of life data, and CGM data. And quality of life data are interesting because they are extremely sensitive. They are much more sensitive than measuring an A1C. The problem is that statistically they are sort of burdened by a lot of variance. So you typically need larger sample sizes than what you need for the traditional measures. We did find an association between quality of life and what we could see on CGM. So in connection with what you say, that's probably an area that can be explored quite a lot also with the impact of GLP-1 analogs. I'm very interested in sarcopenia, and the constellation of the three could be very interesting from a research perspective and from a clinical use perspective, I think.
Yeah, we definitely have been trying to look at objective measures that are representative of some of those quality of life indicators. For instance, gait speed and being able to measure with actigraphy fatigue and activity complexity. And so, Dr. Goldfein, you mentioned some of the weakness and fatigue. So with objective tools, we're able to quantify that during daily living. We can look at how people are walking, not just quantitatively how many steps, which I think is in our past. In the future, now, and what we've been doing is really the quality of movement. And we can certainly see difference in how people are moving with different BMIs and how that can change over time. The other really interesting measure is complexity, where you're looking at intensity and duration of activity, as well as looking at fall risk or other components of disease of fatigue, which we typically use a lot in the CNS motion disorder space, but we're seeing some adaptability in this space as well. And then finally, I'll mention I think sleep quality and sleep apnea, as was mentioned, is a really great opportunity to understand nocturnal glucose baseline, as well as overall quality of the sleeping duration and the sleeping period.
I think this is a fantastic overview of some of the new areas to be explored in these new clinical trials and studies. And I'm curious, including during clinical development, do you think that these additional data, when they are captured, can provide some competitive advantage to the R&D teams? What is it they can help them uncover earlier or faster or more in depth in their populations and in their trials?
All right. I believe that it's very informative data. I think that at the moment, many of these digital approaches are not registratable endpoints, but more and more are becoming registratable endpoints. However, they can answer really important questions, such as if you lose weight, are you more likely to exercise because you are, feeling healthier? Or is the muscle loss that is occurring something that is detrimental? And I think these are very fundamental biological and pathobiological questions, which can be answered by many these tools, some used independently and some used in combinations. So I think that when we really want to understand in depth, these measures are very informative.
I was going to add, actually, Dr. Goldfein opened it up. Not every one of these digital measurements are quantifiable for an endpoint. But what I see a lot, because I'm more on the kind of like the process and the use in early phase trials, I see a lot of these measurements more and more being measured and captured, if anything, for more knowledge and more information as to build the next phase trial even better. They learn a lot from exploratory endpoints. I remember back in 2013 when the EMA and the FDA first came out with CGM guidance to be used in a clinical trial. It was adjunctive, it was not primary use, but everyone was making it as extra data because they could hear a lot of noise in the trial. And I think Paul is probably better explaining how sometimes when you look at this data collected by all these electronic measures, it gives you very unbiased look at what's actually happening behind the scenes with the patient, with the drug, in the trial, in the process of the trial, from visit 1 to visit 2. You get a lot of background information that helps you refine that phase 3 trial or that phase 2 trial. That's it. But Dr. Goldfein, you led me right up into that. With they're not all endpoints, but they really help you build a better and more efficient trial. You can get to
and
a
a safer trial.
And a safer trial, yeah.
For example, they're used both in clinical research and in clinical practice. For example, in patients who have diabetes and are on insulin provisional therapies. And so there they may need less, and to avoid hypoglycemia or complications that you don't want the patients to be experiencing, either in a trial or in real life, that these technologies are complementary and can provide mechanistic information and safety information.
Yeah.
I would actually add one dimension to that, and that is that the worst you can do with a person with diabetes or really healthy is to put them in a clinical pharmacology unit and house them, because it has enormous impact on metabolism, insulin sensitivity. So it's actually much better to do as little as you can in the clinic and then send them out in their everyday lives and then get data remotely. So these technologies collectively has actually allowed that's safe today to do even with first in human trials. perfectly safe to do today. And that wasn't something that was done 25 years ago. So that's something that these technologies have enabled, and they actually give higher quote unquote quality data because we don't mess nearly as much with people's normal lives as we used to do.
Right, and that's been translated not just in diabetes, but in hypertension. We would prefer that people self-monitor blood pressure at home or in their own environment rather than when they come into the clinic and they're highly stressed. We have Zio patches that we insert to monitor, you know, AFib or arrhythmias. So there's a lot of technology that we translate into the patient's environment that is far superior because they're just living their lives than being, holed up in a clinic or hospital setting.
I'm really glad that we talked about the difference between registration endpoints and the value of having data that may not be at that parity yet, but is still very useful in clinical research. And I think that we're seeing these discussions happen a lot where oftentimes, our sponsors come to us and they want to see that validation of the endpoints in order for them to use them in the study. And we're trying to educate with this information can help you with planning for your next study. It can help you really understand behavior in the home, which I think this particular patient population, there's a lot around what's going on remotely, what's going on in the home. And you with maybe one or two devices and continuous data, you really get a very good glimpse of that type of behavior that is, that can be really eye-opening in terms of how to use these measures and leverage these types of measures and tools. So I'm really glad that we made that point here today, and I think that I think that if we can, as an industry, really work towards identifying how these measurements can be used and not just targeting an endpoint, but used more broadly, I think that I think that would be a really great progress for adoption of more of these types of measures.
Thank you, everyone. This is a great discussion, and thank you for all of your insights. So you already started zooming in into the CGM because we have several CGM experts here. So let's maybe stay in that area for a little bit. And we know that the continuous glucose monitoring is also expanding beyond just diabetes, and it can reveal new information about metabolic health, even in non-diabetic or otherwise healthy individuals. So, my question really is, do you think that everyone who are also seemingly healthy should wear CGM for that additional insights and information into their metabolic health?
I'm going to stay
Not
away
say
from that one
everyone.
because it's biased. I'd be very biased, so I'm going to stay away from that one.
Yeah, and I'm going to say no, unequivocally. It should not be used for everyone. It should be used for a distinct set of populations. What those populations need to be have to be defined depending upon what the goals are. What is the hypothesis? Who is the population? I mean, it's sort of like what a reporter does: is a why, what, when, how. Who are the users, and for what purpose? I also want to say that while I think these CGM has the ability to give people a lot of data. We are a society of data overload right now. And so, we have to present this data in a meaningful sort of snapshot way. Otherwise, people are not going to be, people as in the user, probably the patient, is not going to be keeping up with this
I'm
use.
going to add to Dr. Rothberg. I do think that not everybody requires CGM. I think that the variances when you really have a normal glycemic pattern tend to be small. And what are you learning from that? That's different from elite athletes. It's also different from the individuals of prediabetes, who is actually a very large proportion of the population. And there, where you begin to see much more extremes, you see patterns differentiating, what's the difference based on their food choices, portion sizes, and exercise. And for the individual who can look at the data and interpret it with their healthcare provider, that's extremely valuable information. But for a lot of people, they put it on, and are you looking at it? No. Are you changing your medication based on it? No. Are you changing your eating patterns and anything based on it? No. So there you have to go through what is the purpose of using it within the individual patient. And so I just really want to emphasize, Dr. Rothberg did bring that up. So knowing how you're going to use it and why you're going to use it. And it's certainly appropriate for a large proportion of people who can learn from it, maybe not continuously, maybe intermittently. And so how, and then that goes into the when portion that she raised.
I think people with impaired glucose tolerance, which is not really recognized as a disease, even though I think every provider think it is, it has, at least from what I've heard, a lot of ability to do behavior modification that can actually help people. So this comes to the intermittent use that may be very helpful for, and now I'm not talking patients, I'm actually talking just people with impaired glucose tolerance. Many people have no clue how their diet is related to what happens with their glucose and presumably also the progression to further diabetes and pre-diabetes. And there, I think it can be really useful. But it is particularly for that population, I think, when we're outside diabetes. And I don't think it's all the time, because it kind of loses its power for behavior modification if it's not coupled with some kind of conscientious effort. But I mean, as providers now, we have two physicians who are practicing. If you have people leaning towards either, starting metformin therapy, or going on a GLP-1 or whatever, would you give them the chance with a CGM device first and see whether that could actually help? Because there are lots and lots of individual cases where people have been able to actually seeming to regress a little in their disease progression.
I think to wrap up that comment, on the commercial side, not on my research area, but what I see on the other side of the company is basically it's an addition to, so most of the companies that are involved that you see on TV ads, Roe and Signos and Levels and all these companies that are using GLP-1s for weight loss, it's actually coupled with a CGM product, because together you create that behavior modification. But to Dr. Goldfein and Dr. Rothgard's point, unless you have someone behind kind of, I don't want to say directly coaching, but giving them those insights as to what you might be learning, at the end of the day, the drug does its job, the CGM does its job, but the human themselves have to change behavior. So you have to give them the tools to do that, and as someone that has type 1 diabetes for over 60 years, insulin is great, the pumps are great, the pens are great, but it's my behavior that ultimately gets me across the finish line. And CGM, it's not for everyone, but for those that you're trying to make a behavioral change at the end, that's where it's useful, along with any of the many therapies that we see going on.
And I agree. And I'm going to just go back to one of Paul's comments about prediabetes being under-recognized clinically for the clinicians in the audience. There is an ICD-10 code to recognize prediabetes and bill for it. So I encourage you to look that up. It's under the R73 with several points after it, depending on the variants, but you can look that up.
Thank you, Dr. Goldfein, for that. And I would just come back to some of the comments that you have been making, and that, it's one thing to just see the data and another thing to make sense of the data and use it to drive some kind of behavioral change. And I will maybe insert a little question here, right? So, both for the research aspect and also in the commercial aspect, in kind of the real world and the clinical use, how how do you see these data, let's say data explanations, or like the insights from the data serving the researchers and the patients as well, right? So I know that usually they don't get to see the raw outputs. Usually they are seeing some kind of actionable insights or some kind of dashboards. Where do you see specific value in these contexts for the diabetic or obese or populations who are taking GLP-1s?
Well, I think for the individual, it's if you're talking about the behavior modification, it's very much tied to the specific curve. I think for the treatment of diabetes type 1, diabetes in particular, you're also looking at data aggregation over time. And that's where, there is still not consensus. Well, there are several consensus panel reports about it, but there is still not a really super useful, universally recognized way of looking at the data. It tends to be different people have different favorites. So the consensus panel they come up with, in my opinion, way too large panels of different ways of looking at the data, and people get confused. It needs to be simplified, which is probably possible, but there's still a lot of confusion out there. I think in the research side, it's again different because it's all about data aggregation. And I can give an example from, I think, 15 years ago. This was in the relatively early days of using CGM for drug development purposes. We had, I think, 4 weeks worth of data for an investigational product. And based on the CGM data alone, we ended up reformulating, or the sponsor ended up reformulating the product because the time action profile was not what it's supposed to be. So you can see if you can aggregate data correctly or well in early phases of drug development, it can have massive impact on the further development of products. But it's kind of three different things. I mean, anybody can look at a glucose data curve and see that the soft ice actually did something to their glucose. And people can probably also see the aggregate that they work with their clinician on how to interpret. And then there is this third mode, which is when you look at populations and aggregating data for development purposes.
I'm just going to play the devil's advocate here. I mean, I think all of what you said, Paul, was fantastic. But we also need to be looking at this in terms in research, at how we compare it to usual care, whatever the usual care is. Because if it is not better, then why are we even considering it? And I will just say that when you just look at, for example, physical activity trackers or sort of e-health mobile apps, while they are good, depending upon that particular app or device, unpaired with comprehensive care, they are terrible. So alone, as standalone, they are not great, as I think Bob said earlier. You have to pair that with behavioral change. And you can look at them, how much they really augment that behavioral change from baseline, because it may be that just behavioral change is driving all the clinical outcomes, and the e-health or mobile technology has really just very little or limited applicability. So I think we got to really compare too. What are we looking at?
I'd like to add a comment to what you said and about the numerous types of outputs and how there may be too many of them. And I think that for CGM, it's actually very valuable. Different people understand different parts of those data outputs or curves. And so somebody may focus on the average glucose and somebody may focus on the time in range, and having a variety of different things so you can represent to a patient when you're using this in a clinical setting, that which is meaningful to them is very helpful because it is different across individuals. I think from the point of view of using them in clinical trials, which I have done, that we look for different things with different assets that we're developing. For example, you can have a hemoglobin A1C or an average glucose or a GMI that is exactly the same, but one with a lot of variance, high and low, and one with a very smooth curve. And drug like an incretin may smooth the curve, whereas some of those average numbers are different. So I think what you're looking for in different product development differs. And I think having those options so that you can then select what is it that you want to see different or with what you're developing may be really valuable.
Yeah, so thank you for that, because I agree entirely with what you're saying, Alison. I think what my comment was more, for example, looking at variance. I mean, there are 25 different measures of variance, and they are, with a few exceptions, they are actually highly correlated. So it doesn't matter whether you measure standard deviation or MAGE or CONCA or whatever you want. But, the people have favorites out there, but they are really just different measures of exactly the same thing. But looking at average glucose, looking at time in range, looking at variance measures, and there are two different families, but choosing from two different families, if you have that information, you have essentially all of it with maybe 5 measures instead of 25. So, and that's where I think actually the community, I think somehow we need to get on the same page about which ones are the sort of accepted measure for what component of what this is, and can it be reduced? I mean, Boris Kovachev, who spent a lot of time looking at CGM data and is one of the smartest people looking at it, he thinks everything can be reduced to 2 numbers. I think he's too optimistic, but I don't think we need 25.
I just wanted to go back to the point around Lucy that you were asking around, how do we present this data to the end user? And in the case of the patient, I think traditionally with medical devices, with wearables, consumer grade and medical grade, we are regurgitating the data. We're, I think, just scratching the surface in terms of what we're delivering back to the end user. And what we're seeing, where I think we're at the cusp right now of really fusing together a lot of different types of dimensions and types of data together. And instead of just delivering the data back, we need to actually think about really tight feedback loops and kind of just-in-time interventions. And I'm thinking more on the, in the kind of clinical space maybe outside of research, where we know that this particular space is a lot of behavioral intervention and change, as Bob, you mentioned. And so the ability for us to analyze that data in near real time and then deliver feedback and intervention recommendations to the patient, I think I think we can do it technically, right? But the products and services really need to coalesce and work together for us to develop those algorithms and get, I think, to the point of sophistication where the users need us to be. So I'm seeing a lot of beginnings of that type of kind of emerging of different types of data forms together, because you can't, there's only so much we can do with one data source, right? And we want to understand the full context in order to really drive those kind of adaptive interventions that are needed in near real time for people to actually comply with.
Thank
So
you.
that gets into the challenge of FDA wanting to regulate those things. I mean, the fundamental principle in what FDA wants to regulate are those things where people base treatment decisions on what you show. So there is an additional hurdle. I mean, it may be possible to do it on a sort of low friction mode in research, but putting it out in clinical practice, I mean, Bob, he knows everything about how hard it is to get clarity into be accepted by the FDA to be used by patients.
I was just going to say it's a very different world between used in clinical research for an asset, as Allison has said, versus in real use, real world. And you had mentioned like I forgot the term you used, but I think it's like at the moment warning. So anything you introduce to a patient in a clinical trial has the chance of potentially changing behavior. So, and at the end of the day, we're trying to find out if a certain pharmaceutical does what we think it does. So anytime you start putting in suggestions during that protocol, you start getting into, as Paul said, an FDA battle of, well, how much can we tell the patient? How much can we tell the physician? You know, a dashboard now will tell a physician, hey, we think that patient down the street in the next city, wherever, is going to go low in 30 minutes. Should that doctor be reacting to that and making a phone call, or do you let life take its natural course? And it becomes a moral dilemma, because you know what might happen to that patient, but yet to not infiltrate the data of the trial, you don't want to call them. And I'll let the physicians here that deal with patients in a primary investigational site, that becomes a challenge of everyone asks me, well, you know, can the app automatically say someone's going to go low in 30 minutes? I'm like, well, yes, but it's going to change the outcome of something if you start introducing suggestions in real time. And, you know, back in, again, when we started this, it was always blinded CGM data. You did not want it to infiltrate. To Amy's point, there's a lot of people that don't need that much information. And the more you throw at them, the more variability you create in your own clinical trial, that you want to somewhat control variability. And that was a big answer.
No, but these are all, great insights, and you already started going and hinting into the direction of a behavioral change, right? Once a person sees the data, it can change the behavior. But let's now think about the use case when we actually want to change that behavior, right? So we know that for many people on GLP-1 therapies, we want to introduce that positive behavior and like healthy lifestyle changes. And I'm curious whether you think that, in this particular use case, the digital health technologies and, having those insights from the data can be instrumental to implementing these healthier habits and lifestyle changes.
Well, I'll
Yes.
say yes, in clinical practice, again, for a subset of the population, not for everybody, right? There are people who just don't want to use technology, aren't sophisticated, don't have the literacy, even though these are very easy to use, don't want to wear something on their arm, for example. So that I'm just telling you the exclusions. There are many people who do want to get important information, at least in the short term, particularly when we're talking about behavioral interventions around diet and physical activity. But again, it's usually short-lived, the information that they want to get from it, and that is practical for them to use, or on an intermittent basis, as Dr. Goldfein said. But I think that we're not looking at the entire population who is going to use these platforms, across the lifespan. I'll just say I take care of, even though I live in Michigan and work at an academic institution, I take care of a population who lives in the poor zip code of Columbia, South Carolina, and I try to convince them all, to please use this because in a way, I think it will help them and it will definitely help me help them. And unequivocally, they just do not want to use this type of technology, which is interesting.
So,
So
can
we're
I
often studying populations, that sign up for randomized controlled clinical trials, but it's not necessarily, as we always say, the limitation in any clinical trial is generalizability. Can't get that word out.
can I ask a follow-up question to that? If people they don't want to use CGM devices, can you get them to measure finger stick glucose, or is that also something that's difficult to do?
It is difficult to do. Usually they'll do it once a day, fasting.
Yeah.
Mhm.
If you're lucky,
If
wow.
I'm lucky, right. I mean, there's some skepticism, right, around this, even though the technology's been around for many, many years now. There's just, so it's just where we are, who we're taking care of. I'm always getting down to who is our population.
Sometimes when they're very skeptical, you can convince them to do it once, uh, maybe. And if you can, going over the data and sitting down with them, looking at the output reports and what this means clinically for them, can help them use it on an intermittent basis, even when they're hesitant, especially around you've added a therapy. Did it make a difference? They've changed something in their lifestyle. Did it make a difference? So you can get to touch points where you can use in the hesitant person, but there are some who simply don't want to be connected to a device.
Right. And do you
And they all
think,
run around with these, right?
yeah.
Yes, sure do. Uh-huh. And I do remind them of that, and everybody has our data, no matter what. Don't think that, people don't have our data, but I think there is that skepticism. I mean, it's a lot of different things. It's very nuanced. And while I try to give a pitch, you've done hard things. This is not so hard. And no offense, Bob, because you work for Dexcom, but, you know, there are free trials from, Libre, you can get these sensors for 15 days for free. They still don't want to do it.
And I'm curious, do you think that in the next couple of years we are going to see these companion to digital tools for GLP-1 therapies, such as for monitoring, coaching, or feedback that would actually be really tied to these therapies, such as those that are, for example, for smoking cessation or that we saw in the past, that kind of like drug and digital duo to drive long-term success or maybe even some reimbursement decisions. Do you see something like this happening in for GLP-1s?
So I think there are three important parties. It's not a duo of the investigator or physician and the patient. There's a payer involved. And for the payers to universally cover these, you actually also have to provide evidence that's pretty hard that this will make a difference for them and that they should need to cover it. And I think that one needs to show that also in order to really establish the coverage. So often we can get it covered because they have something else that makes it coverable. But I think that we're not there yet for GLP-1s, specifically for weight management.
Thank you. So I see also some questions in the Q&A. So let's maybe pick some and try and answer. There is a question about capturing digital measurements associated with physical activity and whether that could be important to track efficacy of GLP-1 treatments. We know that individuals are being advised to include exercise and activity in their routine to prevent the loss of lean muscle mass. Are there any possible strategies to separately track digital measures of physical activity that would relate to the treatment efficacy versus that would relate to some voluntary involvement in increased exercise activity? I think this is very interesting. Can we distinguish between these contexts?
That's a good question. That's tough. And, I think adding adding context, adding some, diaries would be helpful here because from the sensor data alone, I think that would be difficult to distinguish. We can obviously have baseline understanding of physical activity. We can look at things like HRV and fatigue, as I mentioned earlier, as well as cardiac effort. And so I think that there's a combination of things from the digital measurement tools that we can investigate, and combining that with the diaries might help us understand the differentiation between following guidelines and actually being proactive versus impact from the treatment. But I think from a quantitative data standpoint, that would be very difficult in a silo to be able to determine the difference there.
But, but I mean, we've talked about intermittent use, and in the clinical trial context, it is usually a very good idea to have diary data, as you suggest, together with CGM data, because it really helps interpret what's going on. And I mean, there's some art in designing diaries so people actually enter information in them, but that's becoming better than it has been before, because it used to be something that was dedicated device that people had to log around and all that. Now we just put diaries on people's smartphones, so it's right there. So it's become a lot better. So the quality of the data is, and I would say if you're looking at CGM data and want to really understand it, give people a diary at the same time. It's really helpful.
So from the point of view of the activity, that can also be built in. For example, the CGMs have a place for comments. You ate, you could even put in what you ate. There are activity that you're starting your activity or ending your activity, and so you can bookmark times and almost have, if you will, an electronic diary. What it doesn't really separate is, why are you doing this? Are you doing this? Am I going for the walk because my doctor told me I have to exercise for 30 minutes, 5 days a week? Or are you doing this because I feel better and now I really enjoy going for that walk? And the motivation and the reasons for change are less well captured either in the diaries or in just monitoring the activity or other endpoint per se.
But that's not impossible, though.
Yeah.
Those are all things that you can measure, but it's not something that relieves. It's kind of the evolution is first we measure blood pressure in the clinic, and then we measure blood pressure outpatient, and then now we're starting to get more and more used to have all these measures available, and now we're saying, oh, now we're trying to figure out why is it people do what they do. So that's maybe the next level evolution we go through these devices, that now we have all this data. Now we will start capturing more data to actually understand what it is people do and why they do it. But it's all measurable, I mean, in principle, but it requires that you think about it up front and don't have it as an afterthought and said, oh, I wish we had asked. That kind of happens often.
I think with a little peek into the future and knowing all the different biomarker analytes, things that are being measured, I think there will be a day, and I can't predict it right now, that it'll be a combination of those true measurements that will help you understand activity. Our bodies do things differently when we're moving than when we're sedentary. And while it's great to have a Fitbit on your wrist or something on your ankle or something measuring the physical movement, I think ultimately it's going to be a measurement inside with a combination of how you look at it to know if that true measurement happened or not. And I'm starting to see that on the horizon, where the way they're, and it's not CGM, but CGM could be combined in all of that with rate of change. But it's not so much the measurement, but the quickness of the change that will tell you if activity is happening or not, and give you an actual empirical number to say, okay, they wore it for 2 weeks before the drug, and we know this much activity took place, and we wore it during the treatment, and then 6 months later, and there'll be something measurable with all these combinations of new things we're learning to measure based on multiple sensors small sensors. I've seen some sensors with 3 or 4 readings of 3 or 4 different things coming off the same sensor. So I it's challenge of activity. There's always been a challenge trying to measure true activity. What's because of the trial, what's because I'm in a trial. But I think we will all see within our lives where we can actually measure activity through a byproduct of activity.
I think the sleep period also is
Yeah.
underrated because I think the day there's so much noise during our days, right? And there's a lot of potential for misinterpretation of, of let's say actigraphy. But sleep when we're resting and when, we're looking for like HRV is a great example. And I think a lot about, what we've done in the analysis of HRV with the glucose variability, and how, looking at the sleeping resting periods as really good insight into recovery and how stable the metabolic response is during those sleeping periods. So I think that's a good area. Certainly in the cardiovascular space, we're doing a lot of work in looking at recovery and sleep, right? And maybe that we can learn a little bit and use that same type of methodology for glucose variability as well.
Thank you. I think this has been an amazing discussion. Thank you very much. And we have covered a lot of ground right from the beginning and how GLP-1s actually work and work for different populations through the use cases of using digital health technologies and CGMs in research, but also in care, what it means for the future, and whether there are some new measurements on the horizon. So thank you very much to all of our speakers, all of our panelists for this amazing talk, amazing discussion. A few things at the end. This discussion was brought to you by Medidata and Dime. You can learn more about Medidata sensors if you visit the link behind the QR code. And also, Dime is bringing together groups to advance different topics, different problems. And our next project on the horizon is optimizing direct-to-patient strategies for pharma companies. So if you are interested, please head over to our website, let us know, and get in touch whether if you want to take part in this consortium work. So thank you again very much to our audience, to our panelists as well, and we hope to see you sometimes another time.